friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
And we are two lifelong friends with a combined 25 plus years of experience working and teaching on Wall Street, here to give you the skinny on the world's highest paying jobs and explain what's actually happening in all of your favorite TV shows, movies, and books when there's a plot line involving finance. So for those of you who are new here, this is our long-awaited third installment in our series explaining the finance of HBO's Succession. Although I guess it's Max now.
Oh, is that? Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, Succession is one of the all-time most popular and, in my opinion, one of the best written TV shows.
Yeah.
And basically what it is it's a story following the schemes and machinations of the Roy family, which is meant to be kind of a proxy for the Murdoch dynasty, as they navigate the succession plan, or really like the lack thereof, for the family company, which is kind of akin to Fox. And this is also so timely that we're doing the third installment today, because last night was the series premiere of season 2 of House of the Dragon, which I have not watched. So no
Do
spoilers.
I need to watch that? Because John watches it.
You definitely need to watch it.
I do? Okay.
Yeah, well,
I've been like pushing back on it. Well, that's why I didn't start. I think you had watched the first episode, that first season.
I think it first came out when you were pregnant.
Maybe. But yeah, you were like, nah, you don't need to watch it. It's not good. You won't like it. And I was like, okay. And John's like, but you love Game of Thrones. Like, you need to watch this. You know, I don't know how Game of Thronesy it is, but.
Well, it's very Game of Thronesy. So it's the prequel to Game of Thrones. Yes. Yeah. Have you read the book?
No. Are you kidding me?
No. Yeah, I know you don't read.
I did read Game of Thrones, the first book, but I only might have gotten halfway through. So yes and no.
So I would watch it. I think you were pregnant or had just given birth or something when it came out. There's a lot of disastrous birth things that happen in the show. And so I think my advice to you was maybe don't watch it, because that's a little hard to watch.
Okay.
But anyway.
Fast forward. But okay.
Yeah, maybe do that. Okay, it's really all the same story. There's only like 18 plots under the sun anyways.
Yeah.
In Succession, just like in House of the Dragon, right? There's either a ruler who is dead or dying or contemplating his own mortality. And his offspring and acolytes and hangers-on are trying to figure out who is going to take over the throne, or in this case, the family company. A lot less fire and blood in Succession, but just like Game of Thrones, there's no good guys and nobody ever really wins.
No.
So we're going to get right into it and not do a catch up today, because there's so much to talk about in this season. And in season 3,
this might end up being
the corporate finance gets really, really juicy. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I wouldn't be surprised if this has to be a 2-parter. I have no idea how long we're going, but because there's a lot of drama, but then there's a lot of actual finance that we have to explain. So we'll see how
that's really what we're going to focus on. Yes. We left off season 2 with Kendall, who was Logan's oldest son from his second marriage. And he was a beaten down dog all of season 2 after he killed a waiter at his sister Shiv's wedding. And he went crawling back to his dad to cover it up. So at the end of that whole season, he actually turns around and that beaten down dog bites his master. So the company was being investigated for crimes in the cruises division, which is run by Shiv's husband, Tom. And Logan nominates Kendall at the end of season 2 to take the fall for the whole thing. Kendall agrees, but when he's actually on TV, he suddenly breaks faith and announces that his father was responsible for all of the wrongdoing and is a poison to the company. So here we are, starting season 3 in the aftermath of all of that. So Kristen, I'd love it if you could kind of like tell our listeners where we find the Roy family now after this huge bombshell.
Yeah, so in episode 1, it opens with Ken basically trying to calm down in the bathroom because he's just betrayed his father. I mean, he also was suicidal in the prior season. That's a theme that comes back. And he walks out and then he comes out very composed. He's like, action stations, and he's in a position of strength. He's really proud of himself. The music comes in. And by the way, I love the music. They actually end up walking out of the building. Tons of reporters are there. And Greg, who's the comic relief, like the reporters are trying to get a statement out of Kendall. And he's just like, no comment. And Carolina's like, you don't have to say that. Just don't comment. They get into the car together and they're about to drive off. And Kendall, he's very manic. He's all over the place. He goes from being on the highest high to like the lowest low. And as he's in the car, he's trying to figure out who's on his side, who's not on his side. And he sees Carolina hesitate for a second. And he's just like, you're out, you're gone. So you have sort of the dueling sides where Kendall is trying to figure out who's on his side, trying to shore up his defense, get in touch with lawyers. And Logan, on the other hand, is trying to do the same thing. And Shiv and Roman are actually talking. And, Roman's like, what are you thinking? And Shiv says, well, obviously we're going to back Dad. But what am I actually thinking? I'm thinking he's toast. And they're kind of also figuring out, like, well, what's best for us? Should we actually stay with our father? Should we jump ship and go to Kendall? So you see them both trying to fight this fight. They're, back to the Game of Thrones thing, right? They're sort of like in battle, but obviously in a more legal and less bloody way.
Kendall has just fired the first shot.
Yeah.
They're now at war. Kendall versus his dad. Logan's trying to assess what the damage is. The first thing that he obviously wants to understand is what's the impact to the stock price, right?
True.
And so he's getting a read from all of his consigliaries, from Frank, from Carl, from everybody trying to figure out what it is. Frank gives an overall synopsis about the price action on the stock price after this announcement has dropped. And he says that institutions are dumping. So when you think about institutions, he's typically talking about the real money players, right? The Fidelities, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks, the people managing large amounts of money on behalf of either retail buyers or other institutions, et cetera, et cetera. Basically people who would be the buy and hold investors who are in this for a long-term growth story. He says, but ARBs are buying in case Sandy and Stewie win. So what he's saying there is the fast money players, the hedge funds, the people who are making tactical trading decisions are scooping up this stock as other institutions are dumping it back into the market on the hopes that the initial deal, which we do need to kind of recap a little bit here, ends up coming to fruition. And that's what they mean by Sandy and Stu.
Yeah, let me actually just remind our listeners what was on the table. So we have Sandy and Stewie, who is the arch nemesis of Logan, who had, in the first couple of seasons, teamed up with Kendall to try to make a bid to buy Waystar Royco and do a leveraged buyout. So they're buying the company, but primarily funding it with debt. And this is going to come in later when we get to some of the discussions with Josh Aronson. But so there is this hostile LBO that Waystar Royco is still trying to fight off. Now, the ARBs, so the idea is like there are these merger arbitrage hedge funds that are essentially making bets on whether or not they think a deal is going to go through or not. So when you have a deal, there is where the share price is trading, and then there's the offer price. The offer price usually is going to be anywhere from like 20 to 40% higher, maybe more. And so if the deal goes through, and you buy at a lower price, you're betting that this is going to actually take place. And depending on where the share price is, I mean, if the deal goes through, you've now made a potential, significant premium, again, if the deal goes through. So that's what they're talking about with like, okay, the ARBs are diving in. Like you have institutional investors, as you said, the real money, getting rid of their shares, but the ARBs are potentially seeing that as a buying opportunity to make a bet on this potential deal actually happening. So that's exactly again, the backdrop against this entire season is fighting off this hostile LBO. And then we're going to see a potential new deal that comes up on the table. So
that's exactly right. And so Logan is sitting around soliciting advice from everybody about what to do, even though he obviously has his own plan of what he wants to do.
Oh, of course.
And actually, of everyone who gives him advice after rewatching the season, ironically, it's Roman who gives him the best advice. It's really wait it out. Let Kendall blow himself up because that's what Kendall tends to do. And then rely on the president with whom they have a very strong relationship to back them, put a new attorney general in place, and the whole thing will blow over. Had Logan actually just done that, that's how it probably would have played out. And there would be no drama. That's not what Logan decides to do ultimately this season. But it is really important to understand how in bed this family is with the president and with the current administration.
So, and that's actually where Jerry called the president, but they don't actually get to talk to the president. They get Michelle Ann, and Michelle Ann freaks them out and also gets Logan thinking that that president might not be on his side as much. And so that will come in later as they try to get someone who's going to be favorable to them in the administration. But the point is that they do have this incredible leverage over the president because they have a news network. They have the equivalent of Fox News, and there's clearly a Republican in the White House. And so they have a tremendous amount of power over what happens to the president. So as we have the sort of two parties, Logan is off flying to some country that has no extradition treaties with the U.S. You have Kendall in the car, needs to figure out where to go. He decides to go to his ex-wife's house, Rava. And they basically set up a war room at his ex-wife's house. And I mean, he clearly just like Naomi, his girlfriend, comes over, like opens an old bottle of wine that she was saving. Like there's all this stuff. Like clearly he is pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable.
Not
with
only
his
that,
wife.
by the way, when he comes home to Rava, he expects this hero's welcome.
Yeah.
He's like, did you watch it? I did it all for you and the kids, and kind of trying to like humble brag, like, you know, this is really all about you. And Rava's like, you know, actually, I haven't had time to watch that news segment, but I heard you did great. And he realizes like no one is buying his shtick, right? Like at every single turn, he realizes that he's not the hero that he thinks he is.
Well, it's like they are and they're not. Like his ego is so tied up. And at one point they're reading like mean tweets, but they're like great tweets. And he gets all excited because the Pope followed him. And again, it's feeding his ego. And
but
then
it's
there
not
will be.
The Pope, then it's like, wait, somebody actually named Pope.
Yeah. But the thing is that like he is getting some of the adoration. I mean, even the communications people that they hired was like, you know, some things we do for the heart and some we do for the pocketbook. Like this is and part of it is probably like they're BSing him.
Bullshitting him, 100%.
With Logan versus Kendall, they're also trying to get the best attorney. And he also does win the best attorney, which becomes a plot point.
Hang on. That's part of like a bigger framework. So
true.
So you're exactly right. Kendall retains Lisa Arthur before the rest of the family has a chance to get to her. He's already made an appointment with her, and therefore she cannot take on any confidential information or really even take a meeting with the Roys. So Logan announces to his closest advisors that he's going to take a step back from being
he says
the
it's
CEO.
war, but I'll take a step back temporarily as CEO. Who do we like? I don't give a fuck. It's a nameplate. So they ultimately want to put someone else in as CEO. He says, would love a kid, but want a woman. Want experience, means Roman or Jerry. Tom calls Shiv to tell him that they're going to be picking a new CEO. Frank calls Jerry. And there's now like this whole, it's the Succession story all over again. They're all fighting for who's going to be even put in as the temporary CEO. But
one of the things that Tom points out to Shiv is even though it's a temporary job, he lists some deal precedents that actually show that this could be a long position. He talks about VW where it was 5 years and Walmart where it was 10. So this is being dangled as this thing that is very meaningful to all of these people contending for power. And so when Logan's considering the different candidates for who's going to be the interim CEO, it's really interesting to see his thought process on that. Because as always, I do think that Logan always knows what the answer is going to be, but wants to see how these people play themselves. And so like you said, he's tossed out Roman, he's tossed out Shiv, he's tossed out Jerry. It's funny because Carl and Frank just totally blow themselves up. Like they were never contenders. And he even asked Tom if he thinks it should be him. And Tom's like, absolutely not. It should never be me. But thanks for even asking, you know? And so initially, he kind of seems to be leaning towards Roman. And he calls Roman and says kind of, how do you feel? And Roman says, I think it should be me. It's my time. And you see the look on Logan's face. And if he'd shut up right there, if he'd stopped talking, they imply that Logan actually might have gone with Roman. And then Roman can't get out of his own way. And he's like, but if you don't think it's me, if like you feel like maybe I kind of understand if you like don't feel it's me. And then what he does is he realizes he's kind of shot himself in the foot.
Yeah.
And he realizes if he's going down, he's going to take Shiv with him. So he puts in a plug for Jerry while he's on the phone with Logan. And so at the end of the call, he's like, yeah, but it should still be, and I really like it to be me, whatever. Logan hangs up the phone and goes, Roman's out.
Yep. So
and then he gives Shiv
a test.
The test. Yeah. Exactly. And so, sorry, that's where Lisa Arthur comes back in.
So, and Shiv is friends with Lisa. So Shiv then has, again, a task to do. If she can prove herself, then she's going to obviously be put in as CEO. And if she fails, then she's not. So she goes to Lisa and tries to get her to come in as and it's like an awkward meeting. I forget the nuances of the actual.
What's interesting about it is allegedly this is her quote unquote friend. If this is how I spoke to my friends, even in a business context, like, dear Lord, I don't think I have any friends. Shiv initially tries to broach it by saying, listen, I know you can't work for my dad because, like, my dad's not kosher. But, like, hey, as a woman, I find myself in this pickle. Couldn't you come in and advise me? And Lisa sees right through it. And when she says, I can't meet with you because – the implication is that she's already taken a meeting with Kendall, even though she doesn't say that outright. Shiv, I mean, short of spitting in her face, Shiv is so rude to her and basically storms out of the office. And that's when Logan gives the interim CEO title to Jerry because Shiv blew it.
Yeah. Yep. So at that point, you have Roman, towards the end of the episode, Roman and Shiv are both driving places, and then they both decide that they're going to go drive to Kendall's.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to touch on that I thought was a really interesting theme is, so they're stranded at all these various airports throughout. And Carl, who's actually like one of my favorite comic relief characters, he's the CFO, right? The chief financial officer, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
So Carl keeps asking for food. Carl's like, hey, should we order some food? Like, we're all going to be trapped in this room. And there's this big theme throughout Succession. I don't know if you remember, we talked about it in the last season. We've talked about it before, where there's always an abundance of food around them. This actually even comes into play in season 4 with the negotiations with Gojo, with like the big breakfast buffet. Anyways, there's always food around them, but no one ever eats, or no one who's currying favor with Logan ever eats. And when Carl asks for food, Logan says something like, food, like, we're running on saliva and adrenaline. Like, and he says it's because he's paranoid about food poisoning. Like, he's like, if I get, food poisoning, this all goes down. But I actually think that there's something so much deeper beyond that. And like, tending to human frailty in any way, shape, or form is seen as a weakness, right? If you actually need to like feed your body with a bagel, you are somehow weaker than. And I think that's just a really interesting theme throughout. And they do use a lot of language about like appetites and about like, I'm going to eat you, like all of this language that's very visceral. And I think that that's
feels like we are talking about dragons. But yeah.
Well, yeah. And it's funny because I saw a clip today on social media where Armie Hammer broke his silence about being labeled a cannibal.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
made me think of that. But anyways, so one other thing I wanted to mention from episode 1, too, that was a funny point is we do get a little glimpse of Connor and Willa. So Connor is the firstborn son. And the reviews are coming in from her play that he underwrote. Like, she wrote a Broadway play or whatever, and it is universally panned as the worst play ever. And he's trying to figure out a path to recoup some of that investment. Yes. So he's like, why don't we go and find the worst reviews and really lean into that and get on the quote unquote Irano cycle, getting people to hate watch it, which made me so sad. I actually wanted to do a deep dive into the financing of plays, but we do not have enough time for that here. But like, again, with the exception of a few that have made billions of dollars, like I think Wicked earned $1 billion during its first couple of years. Yeah. But with the like, you got to be Wicked, okay? If you want to make money
Wicked or Hamilton, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
exactly.
One of the things, and this actually just shows how much Logan is turning on his kids / like full of shit. There's one point, I think in episode 2, where Logan actually says to Connor, "You're my number one." Like, and it's like, no. Connor is just the running joke of the family, which we, again, will get into in a while. But the beginning of episode 2 is where Shiv and Roman are both in the car. Logan is freaking out, wants to know where everybody is. He can't get a hold of anybody because, again, the kids are pissed off that he's put Jerry in as the CEO.
Yeah.
And so they are heading to Kendall's. Now, Kendall wants Greg to call his grandfather. And this, again, becomes a huge funny plot point. But Greg is nervous and Tom keeps calling him. And Tom goes outside and tries to basically intimidate Greg to come back to the Logan side. And Greg basically replies, do you know that Shiv is here? And so I think they're like, oh, shit. So Shiv comes in, talks to Kendall. Kendall's, not, I think, starting off on the best way to get them on board. He's like, you're just upset that I did what you want to do. Because
Kendall always misjudges his position. He thinks he's operating from a position of strength and they should be so lucky to come crawling over to him. And really all that's happening is Roman and Shiv are just evaluating what their options are.
Yeah. I mean, and so it's not that they're coming over hat in hand. They're just trying to figure out what the options are. And he's
what they stand to gain.
Yeah. And
how much he has, right? They want to know how much he has on their dad.
Yeah, exactly. And so Kendall, Roman, and Shiv basically all talk. Kendall's trying to tell them on, let's team up and take down dad. And Roman and Shiv are still kind of, because I think they're trying to like position each other. Like they don't want to give up any information to the other. So like, oh yeah, we're both here on Logan's behalf. Connor ends up showing up too. So it's the entire family. And they start to get into like their whole little weird, creepy, sibling. They're actually the creepiest siblings ever. Like the stuff that they say to each other is like very, I don't know.
This
it's
episode
wild.
was really just about a deeper dive into the sibling dynamics and what the history of the power dynamics has been, you know, where, and you get these glimpses, and this happens throughout the entire series, where you get these glimpses of like the siblingness, right? That they could just be anybody's brother or sister. And you get these moments where they're either joking together or telling some old story, but at the end, it always kind of turns to poison. Whatever story it was, it's always designed with this last twist of the knife. It's never just like, remember that time when you peed the bed at the sleepover? It's like, and now I'm going to dig the knife in, right? And that's just indicative of their relationship. So that's kind of the majority of episode 2 is really delving more into that relationship.
They do. So Kendall does actually get into a limo at one point with Sandy and Stewie and is back to saying like, you know, back me. And this is, I think, is this where we first meet the Sandy's daughter? Or no?
I think so. Season? I don't recall seeing her in season 2, but it's been a while since we did season 2. It doesn't matter.
But so she does become like a main player because for whatever reason, like the older
her name
Sandy
is also
has
Sandy.
like syphilis. Yeah, which is that, yes. And her like the older Sandy has like syphilis now. Or
wait,
it's
does
unclear.
he actually have syphilis?
I don't think
I thought that was a joke.
Oh, it was a joke actually because Jerry goes, you know, I thought we started that rumor. He's in a wheelchair. He can't talk. He was like. He
has
not at all handicapped.
His daughter, also named Sandy, to speak on his behalf.
But with an I. It's like Sandi. I got actually really confused about that until I figured out that it was like her name.
That's why you got to watch on closed caption.
True. I know. It was, so she's in the car and Kendall is basically there trying to give them the same offer as in Greece, except for with Logan out. They're trying to figure out, does it make sense? So after he has the conversation with Sandy and Stewie, he's back talking to the siblings. And Shiv is trying to figure out, like, well, what is the option that is potentially on the table for me? So she's like, all right, let me play out an option. You win, take Dad out. I don't see us coming through in the proxy battle, right? Shareholders don't like confusion. Kendall says, we give Dad the revolver, show him the office, proxy battle over. Sandy and Stewie won't back down, no vote. We'd have a settlement. I don't know what to think about Dad, but he was going to send me to jail and he'd do the same to you, Roman, Connor, Shiv. I don't know, maybe. Like,
so what does that mean in plain English?
Oh, just that they don't think that the shareholders are going to actually vote for the sibling teaming up and taking out their father. That's the whole thing. Like, they have to get the shareholders on board because without the shareholders, they're not going to just be like able to take over. So that's what they're saying, is that they're trying to figure out if they all team up, what does that outcome look like? This is Shiv trying to figure out, is this going to actually potentially result in a better outcome versus if she just sticks with Logan? And there's this one part where I thought it was hilarious. Like, Logan sends the kids donuts and Connor goes to eat one and Shiv was like, I wouldn't eat those. And Connor goes, you think Dad sent poison to the house of his grandkids? To which Roman's like, I'm 98% sure those aren't poisoned, which speaks to...
Well, and that's not the first time it's implied during this that, again, food is poison. That
comes back.
Actually plays out in very literal terms. And it's all, again, part of the same representation that I was talking about in episode 1 with don't eat the food. Don't ever eat the food.
Yeah. The episode wraps up. The kids decide the Kendall thing is not going to happen. They leave. And Shiv gets in the car with his dad. And I actually thought this was interesting because he says he wants Shiv in as president at the top with credibility to be his eyes, ears, and heart of everything. And going through this shitstorm wearing a full biological and chemical suit going by the name of Jerry. So he's basically trying to position what he's doing as, look, Shiv, you're the president, you're doing all the stuff, but I'm protecting you because if anything bad happens, it's Jerry who's going to be the one who gets killed. Basically, like with things getting rough, almost like when he put Rhea in the prior season. So,
do we believe Logan on that?
No, of course not. It's the same way of course not. But that's the thing. The kids keep just almost like taking any crumb of belief that they're going to be the next successor / like any love he will give. And even if it's pure bullshit, he just told Connor that he was number 1 earlier in the episode. He's full of shit all the time. But I mean, I think she wants to believe it because what's her alternative?
That's a really good point. My other favorite moment in this episode was there's a call between Tom and Shiv. And if you remember at the end of season 2, things between Tom and Shiv are not good. He has told her explicitly that he is not happy. And she's made it known that there's no actual love in this marriage.
Yeah.
And they're on the phone together, and Shiv asks Tom if he loves her. And
this is, yes.
Yeah. She asks him if he loves her. And he is like trying to play hard to get, at this point. And he's like, oh, you can't just, take my love and bank it and then go to the love market and see if you want to invest, and they're going back and forth about whether or not they can say, I love you. And so she says, I love you, because it means nothing to her. And he goes, oh, well, I'm glad our love portfolio isn't unbalanced. And then he finally says, I love you too. And it's a hilarious scene that they're using this ridiculous financial jargon to describe their relationship. But at the core of it, it actually does speak to how transactional their relationship is starting to become. That it is only about how much leverage their relationship brings either of them in terms of positioning themselves within this whole family and within this whole corporate dynamic. So it's it's a funny scene. It's absolutely absurd, but I did want to point that out because that is critical towards the evolution of Tom and Shiv within this season.
And what happens at the end, which we're going to get to with like the huge betrayal.
Yes.
All right, so episode 3, this was called The Disruption. Logan's starting to regret his choice of putting in Jerry because they're like, she's taking her job too seriously. She thinks she's actually the CEO. She's not the CEO.
She's actually trying to do a good job.
Figurehead.
He's mad about it.
Yeah. So she's trying to like buy an Israeli gaming company. Logan is not happy that she's doing stuff that he is not explicitly telling her to do. There's a funny scene. So Tom shows up in Greg's office. He's like downgrading him to a janitor's closet as an FU for betraying him.
It's like the copy room. It's the copy room.
Oh,
right?
is it?
Like,
okay.
Yeah. So it's like a public space with printers and scanners, like where people are coming in and out and filing cabinets.
Yep. Greg says, this is punishment because I'm not taking the company lawyer and I'm getting demoted in the middle of an investigation. And he's like, no, this is purely an office rationalization. So,
Well, but they're showing how Greg is all of a sudden on the outs because he's on Team Kendall. One thing we didn't touch on in episode 2 is that a lawyer approaches Greg.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is a lawyer that is retained by Waystar Royco. And they kind of try to bully Greg into accepting counsel from this lawyer so that he can be part of the joint representation agreement for everybody under Logan's umbrella. And it's actually very well done because Greg knows just enough to be like, wait, are you my lawyer though? Like, who are you? And the guy's like, don't worry about it. Just like, sign here, say this stuff. Like, don't worry, I'm your lawyer. Yeah. So Greg actually does have the presence of mind to decide to retain independent counsel. And he goes to his grandfather to assist with this process, which is also equally hilarious.
And so over the course of this episode, I think you start to see Greg start to decide, like, should I be with Kendall or not? Because the thing is, Kendall has zero loyalty to Greg. Kendall tells Greg that, like, oh, you should get a Rolex. And Greg believes, they're in the car, Greg thinks that Kendall's buying him this. So he's picking out these watches. He looks for this really expensive watch. And he I think he's like a little nervous. He's like super awkward again. It's like his normal Greg play. And he picks out a watch. And then when the guy's like, okay, like, he needs to pay for it. And Greg was like, oh yeah, I think Kendall's paying it. And he's like, hey, Kendall, are you paying for this? He's like, nah. And again, this I think was Kendall. Like, if he had just bought him the damn watch, it was nothing to him. He could have kept Greg, but Greg ultimately does go back to Logan because he realizes that Kendall's he doesn't manage people well. He doesn't keep people.
It was a $40,000 watch. Greg wants to feel like he's part of this exclusive club of winners.
And there was this one scene where he was like, this is so exciting. This must be like, when OJ got in the car chasing OJ.
That's in the first episode when they're in the car leaving.
Yeah.
And then Greg says, except you didn't kill anybody. And Kendall goes, who says I haven't killed anybody? Which is, we know as the viewer that he has killed someone. Greg doesn't know that.
But it also speaks to his mind. But that's actually, it was interesting because even that alone speaks to his frame of mind, which previously, like, that was what, again, destroyed him. And in this, he's making light of it. It's a joke because he feels on top of the world. He's just betrayed his father and his so. But that again goes. He thinks he's untouchable. But that's and this is where they read the mean tweets and there's a number of nice things that are said. And then one thing someone writes, Kendall clearly has a mental illness. This whole thing is sad. And it's like, that takes the whole thing down because he is so sensitive. And again, it's like manic depressive. He swings wildly. And this is where you start to see him start to like almost have this downfall, because so he is getting made fun of by this late night comedian, and Kendall decides he wants to go on the show. And his communications people are like, this is a bad idea. But he's like, nope, I want to go on the show. So that's in the works. And Shiv, meanwhile, there's this whole plot line where she needs to give a talk at the Waystar office. And Kendall, I believe, comes in, and as she's about to give a speech, puts on the song Rape Me by Nirvana, which obviously like reminds people of the scandal and everything that's been going on. And she feels so betrayed by that she decides that she's going to write a scathing statement on Kendall, talking about how he is a drug addict, absentee father, serial liar, history of problematic relationships with women, and goes to the brothers, to Kendall and Roman, and says it'd be more powerful if it was signed by both of you. They say no. They were just like, this is actually too far. I mean, you have to give them a little bit of credit, but they were like, it's a greeting card from hell Times New Roman firing squad. So they say no, but she still puts the press release out, and it hits the tape right as he's about to go on stage with this comedian. And again, he felt on top of the world. He felt like he was going to go and like, be able to defend himself. And this comes out. And again, it's like he's back down in the hole. It just tears his confidence. And he ends up, I think, just disappearing. I don't even think he tells him he's not going to do it. I think he just goes into a room and just sits there like cowering in a corner. And at the end of the episode, ultimately, well, actually, if there was anything you wanted to say about that, because I was going to say ultimately the FBI shows up. But was there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. We did an interview with Anthony Scaramucci recently, and he talked about how to handle very public failures and embarrassments, and how if you're going to be part of the cultural zeitgeist, you have to be able to take a joke and not take yourself too seriously. And Kendall is so desperate to prove that he's part of the cultural zeitgeist because that's what he's relying on. He's relying on being part of the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. And he's a defender of women. He walks into the journalism conference with Naomi Pierce on his arm. The press is behind him. And he thinks that he's the darling of the media. And he's like, should I give him something? Should I give him something? And she's like, I don't know. And he turns around and he goes, fuck the patriarchy, which is the most tone deaf, absurd, ridiculous, and cringy thing for him to do. He doesn't believe any of these things. He just wants to be part of the narrative. And he thinks that he's in on the joke, right? Yeah. And he starts to realize that they are not laughing with him. They are laughing at him. And that becomes increasingly clear via this comedian. It is the opposite of the Scaramucci mindset, where it's like, hey, I screwed up. Let me laugh about it. Let's all laugh about it and move on. Let's find something better to talk about in terms of what I can do. And Kendall is so fragile, and everything hinges so much on what other people think of him that the second he realizes that they are not laughing with him, they are laughing at him, he completely crumbles.
Yeah. Yeah. You start to see glimmers of like the old season 2 Kendall. There was another thing that just spoke to how terrible a father Logan was. So they're going on this like press tour, trying to make Logan look good. By they, I mean, it's the brothers, right? So Roman is going out on these talk shows, and he had gone into talk show and, was talking about how Logan was such a great dad. He used a fishing trip as an example. And Logan asks him about it later. He's like, what was this fishing trip? And Roman's like, yeah, that was Connor who took me. But, memories. Like the thing is they have nothing good to say about him because he's been a terrible father. And so he literally is making up stories from his brother to try to show his dad as a good dad. Like he's just such a terrible person. And then at the end of the episode, the FBI shows up and is raiding Waystar's office. And that's where we find ourselves into episode 4. So, okay, so this actually has some interesting things with relation to some of the numbers associated with Waystar. And so we talked about this, I think, in the Skinny On podcast, how Jen and I are using Succession Waystar as our case study for the entire course that we are building. And it was really important to be authentic to the numbers and to the valuations and all that. And so there was actually a lot of clues as to what the valuation of the business was and all that kind of stuff. Josh says he's lost 10% of his 4%, So his $350 million means that the value of the business when he bought in was $87.5 billion. And so I'll kind of get into that a little bit. But in this episode, you have one of the major shareholders. So this man, Josh Aronson, he wants to talk.
He's played by Adrian Brody, which was a terrible casting decision, I thought.
Yeah. So he's this billionaire, has a private island, and he wants to make sure as they're entering in this proxy fight with Stewie and Sandy and then obviously the Roys, he wants to decide how he should vote. So he wants to meet face to face with Logan and Kendall to see, like, can you actually exist together? So Kendall basically gets called into a conference room and they say, share price is going down. Investors are getting spooked. Josh Aronson and his 4% holdings are thinking of switching to Sandy and Stewie. He wants to get in the room with Kendall and Logan to make sure the family business can still function. And they're 4 days away from the shareholder meeting. And so Kendall is initially like, fuck you, God bless, this doesn't work for me, but ultimately does agree to it. There's also a scene where you can see like the Bloomberg stock price chart. So I love that the showrunners were so just authentic to everything. Like they have fake Bloomberg charts with share price data, 52-week high lows, like all that kind of fun stuff. But so Kendall and Logan go to this island. They both show up on separate private planes because they obviously don't want to meet together. They were supposed to meet at the little airport on this private island, but Kendall decides to go ahead. So he shows up and he wants to actually talk to Josh. And he says, look, I'm better than my dad, but my dad is better than Sandy and Stewie. And so Josh replies, he's like, well, my other option is just get out entirely, right? So dump his 4% holding. Kendall says, the comment is coming. I think a single acquisition. We buy an oven-ready UI, machine learning, social media, social app. We buy Gojo. And this is where they first float the idea of buying Gojo, which is going to become a huge plot point in the end of the season and then into season 4. So he says, we buy Gojo. Josh says it's a little overpriced. Kendall says, I don't know, great UI, shitty content meets shitty UI, great content. And
okay, so let's pause and explain what all of this means.
Yeah. So the whole thing is he wants to essentially have Josh reject this leveraged buyout. Mm-hmm. And Josh later does say, he's like, they're just doing financial engineering. I can do that on my own. I could basically go to the bank and essentially, if I wanted to put a position in you guys, I could lever it off myself. So I don't need someone else to be doing a leverage buyout, which is a obviously good thing for them. But the whole premise with Waystar is that they are a legacy media company that is in decline. Mm-hmm. And their valuation obviously is getting hurt, right? They don't know who the successor is going to be, blah, blah, blah. And so if they're able to get a distribution platform that is more modern, right? So think like Netflix, think maybe Hulu, I don't know. Think of a distribution platform, a UI like that is much better.
And what does UI stand for our listeners who may not?
User interface.
Correct.
Them together, right, would be much more valuable than them as standalone companies. In theory.
I also just want to reiterate that Waystar has tried to venture into this space, and as we'll learn later, they have a streaming platform that totally sucks, is antiquated, and they don't have a social media platform. Yeah. So they are not part of the next generation of how young people interact with their content. So that's a huge thing that they are missing, that buying this made-up company, Gojo, which has the streaming capability and has the social media angle, is what will take them from being a company that's on the decline, like you said, to being a continued powerhouse as the media world continues to evolve.
Because remember, Gojo doesn't have the content library. And as I was saying, there's parallels, right? Where did the showrunners get the inspiration for this particular story? It was Fox and it was Rupert Murdoch. And by the way, Rupert Murdoch did sell 20th Century Fox to Disney, and it was an $85 billion deal. They spun off, meaning they created a separate public company called Fox Corp, and the remaining $85 billion entity was sold to Disney in a 50-50 cash stock deal. By the way, keep that in mind because it's going to come back later when we get into the Gojo transaction. So the point was that there was real content assets and IP that Waystar had.
That Disney acquired.
And then now they're
in that deal. Exactly. And that's exactly what they're paralleling here. So any of you who have a Disney Plus subscription, imagine Disney Plus without Marvel and without Star Wars.
X-Men.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's great. Yeah. X-Men's under Marvel. So it's
I don't know Fantastic Four.
Are you
I'm looking up the list. Yes.
You're Googling
it was like
the Marvel list. Every
20th
single superhero movie ever made basically is Marvel, except for the DC universe with Batman and Superman and, all the ones that have failed, basically. But so Disney already had great content, right?
Yeah.
But now think about all the content that they acquired. And that's, again, the parallel to this deal. So just think about that from Gojo's standpoint. Imagine if Gojo was
the difference
all
was
the
Gojo had no
crappy,
content.
Right. Well, or again, like the knockoff crappy stuff that you see in like the depths of Netflix, where it's like the off-brand cartoons that my kids watch occasionally, right? Like that kind of crappy content versus Disney.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what's going on here, is that this is where you first hear even whispers about a possible deal with Gojo, that they want to buy Gojo. Fast forward.
And it's Kendall's idea.
It is Kendall's idea. Yeah. No, I mean, that's such a good point. I mean, it is his idea. Logan shows up. Kendall gives him like a super awkward hug. And they end up saying like, Josh says, let's go for a walk. And they're a little worried because obviously Logan is old. He's in his 80s. He recently had like a stroke or something. And I don't know what the weather is, but like they want to go for a walk. And
well, they're bundled up. It honestly looks like a New England summertime. Like it's allegedly summer, but everyone's wearing hats.
That's fair. I know. This is true. And so they do go for a walk, and Josh asks Kendall to backpedal on his shit, say he was wrong, and back down. Kendall feels like he's being ambushed, so he's not exactly happy with it.
Josh is just trying to suss out what the dynamic is between Kendall and Logan. Can they work together? Yeah. Is there a future with them? Or does he need to cast his lot in with Sandy and Stewie? Or dump his shares altogether? Again, like you said, that's the decision tree he's trying to make. And he's sussing out their relationship. And he basically holds a gun to their head and asks Logan whether or not he likes and loves Kendall. And Logan talks out of one side of his mouth just to say what Josh wants to hear and says he's a good boy.
He says, I love Kendall. He did what he thought was best. Maybe one day he'll take over. He's learned everything from me. Maybe he's the best of them all. It'll be okay. Right. He's literally saying everything that Kendall probably could have wanted to hear. And also what Josh wants to hear.
And Kendall is sitting there living and dying with every word of this.
Yeah.
And
it's so sad. Yeah.
It's so sad because that's what Kendall wants at the end of the day, is not only to be the hero, but he wants his father's approval. We know that about all the children, that they're living and dying with every word that Logan says about them. Yeah. And Logan will say whatever he needs to say for the good of his company. And he thinks that it's in his best interest right now to tell Josh, no problem. I can get along with Kendall. At the end of the day, we fight, but what family doesn't? And everything is going to be just fine with our continued leadership together. Josh says, okay, let's wrap up this lunch. And Kendall and Logan are stuck there awkwardly looking at each other. And you can see Kendall like wanting to try to say something, and kind of be like, did you really mean it, Dad? And it's very clear that Logan's like, I fucking hate you. You're a snake. I wish I could, I'd take you out back and shoot you if I could, but I had to say this for the benefit of the company.
Yeah. So Josh is actually feeling pretty good. And so he basically says, look, all I want then is some EPS juicing, which that just means that you think about earnings per share, it's just your net income over the shares. And for a lot of larger companies, there's two ways to grow EPS, which by the way is the equity investors' claim on the earnings. Because if you think about the company, you have your sales, you have your expenses, but then anything that needs to be paid, right, goes to your lenders. They actually have a decent amount of debt. We know they have debt. You then have your taxes, and what's left over, that is the net income. And so when you think about the claim that a investor has on the business, it is that net income, but then over shares, because you are going to, for every one share you have, you're going to get that claim. And the two ways that you can increase the value of the earnings per share is you can grow sales, you can cut costs, right? You theoretically could pay down debt. The other thing you could do is just reduce the number of shares, because if you're buying back shares with the free cash flow you're generating, now again, EPS can go up. And that's actually what you see with a lot of like larger companies that are lower growth. They are going to be doing a lot of the share buyback to increase the earnings per share. So he says, look, I would like some EPS juicing, stock buyback. Logan agrees to consider it. Meanwhile, everything that he's saying to Josh is just like, whatever. But then as they start to walk back, Logan starts to have a problem. So he starts to, I forget if it's like they're worried about him having a heart attack, but he's having trouble walking.
Yeah, he can't physically walk back. Yeah. He seems like he's on the verge of a heart attack. It's funny.
Yeah.
I forget exactly what Josh said, but he's like, oh, this is a short way back, but sometimes it takes longer.
Yeah. And then they get lost. So it's like and he can't figure out how to get home on his own private island. Yeah. And anyway, this whole thing obviously spooks Josh because Logan looks weak. And so at the end of the episode, I believe, so the show closes with Roman telling Kendall that Josh is backed out. He has no faith in the post-dad succession. And the episode closes with Kendall seeing Stewie hugging Josh as Stewie lands on the private island. So that is the conclusion of this whole episode. So episode 5 is called The Retired Janitors of Idaho. Their annual shareholder meeting is getting set up. It's the 50th anniversary of the media giant. And this is the proxy battle between Maysbury Capital and Logan Roy. And it's too close to call. So each side spent $100 million apparently to win the vote, but it's too close to call. And so Carl walks in saying that they were working until 5 a.m. to negotiate with Sandy and Stewie, but they wanted the moon on a stick. And so they wanted 4 board seats. And they all expect to lose the company because they actually don't think that they have the votes to make this go through because of what just happened with Josh. So Stewie walks into Kendall's resistance room and Kendall is trying to broker a deal. And he says he knows that Stewie's financing is starting to wobble. Stewie says, well, we lose, we walk. And Kendall replies, yeah, with a $50 million hole in your pocket. You want something out of this. Sandy wants to hurt my dad. You think my dad will walk away, but my dad is a psychopathic narcissist. So Stewie ends up thinking about it, calls Jerry, and says he wants to meet.
Hang on. Why, if he walks away, is he going to have a $50 million hole in his pocket?
Well, I assume that and actually that's a good question. I assume that it's probably because number one, they each spent $100 million to win the vote. So that's money out the door. So I feel like it should be higher than 50. But then number 2, I assume there's probably some kind of termination fee. But actually, I don't know if there would have been yet because it hadn't. Usually they're bigger than that. So I don't think the $50 million I think that $50 million is for trying to win the shareholder vote. But that's a good question. I'm not sure.
I assumed it was a deal break fee.
This is such a huge deal that $50 million seems low because, for example, I think that when Twitter, which was a $44 billion deal, and this is an $85 billion deal, I think it was $1 billion. So $50 million seems very low. But we can talk about that. So really quickly, when there is a merger agreement that's in place, and I don't believe they have a merger agreement. I think this is still a vote. But when there's merger agreements that is in place, what you want to do is, because it is expensive to do the due diligence on a business, to lock up the financing, do all these things, hire lawyers, hire consultants, and you spend all this money to do a transaction. So when you agree, there's usually breakup fees. So these termination fees, there's also reverse termination fees, but it's basically money that the party that decides to walk away from the deal has to pay to the other side. Essentially to hopefully more or less make them whole for a lot of the things that they've lost / be an incentive for them to not walk away. But again, I don't believe because it's such a small
maybe it was just
number,
their due diligence that they had spent.
Yeah, but again, I mean, they said that they had spent $100 million already to win the vote. So that's money out the door, and that's even more than the 50. So I don't know why it was 50. That is a very good question, but that is a good point. And anyway, we got to talk about breakup fees. So
yeah, I was trying to lead the witness with the breakup fee there, but that's interesting.
I just think it's too small.
Low. Interesting. Yeah. So what is Kendall ultimately suggesting that Sandy and Stewie do?
Back off the transaction and get the board seats. They don't want to do this deal. Like that's ultimately they want this transaction to be off. They don't want this deal to go through. So
but it's not that they just walk away from the company. It's that they would retain some position within the company just at great diminishment from full control.
But the comic relief in the background is that they have this annual shareholders meeting that is going on.
They're all scheduled to give speeches at this shareholder meeting. And they've all got these canned talks that they're supposed to give with these graphics behind them with like stock corporate images of everyone looking happy and talking about how they've learned from their mistakes. And so Frank is supposed to give a bit of a short speech followed by Jerry and Carl. But because Jerry and Carl are close to the deal-making and negotiations that are happening between Waystar and Sandy and Stewie, they keep telling Frank to stay out there and vamp. So he keeps saying like, without further ado. And then he's like, with much more ado. And has to go back and make up like 20 more talking points.
Well, because they want to announce that the deal is off, but like the deal is not yet off. So they're just trying to stall as long as they can. And they're just like, they have no idea. Which is, again, like amazing. So again, amidst the backdrop, in episode 3, we didn't really get into this, but Shiv wanted Tom to agree to get Greg to sign the joint defense agreement, and he does. So Greg is now back with the company, and he's pissed off his grandfather because his grandfather had, I guess, like gone out on a limb to get this lawyer for him. And
I wouldn't describe it as going out on a limb.
Right, no, it wasn't. But like, it was. I think that it was a friend. I think that the lawyer actually was probably a friend. Yes. And so his grandfather is super pissed at him for backing out on the lawyer that he had helped him get.
Well, and for basically going back to the Roys. That's why he's pissed
and that too. Oh, that's a good point.
It's because his brother hates...
Not so much that's true.
His brother hates Logan and has a lifelong feud against him.
So he says that he's going to transfer his entire estate to Greenpeace when he dies, and ultimately starts this whole thing where Greg is on a vendetta against Greenpeace, which becomes amazing in the next episode. But
what's funny is he says is Greg is like, wait, so all of your estate? And he says, starting with your portion. And Greg's like, how do you determine which portion is which in the waterfall of an estate, right? Like hoping maybe he's at the bottom. Like, how can he be starting with his? Yeah. It's obviously just a turn of phrase there, but just showing how irate his grandfather is with him. That's choosing Greenpeace, which at face value is, if you had to pick one organization that seems least aligned with the values of Waystar Royco, it's going to be Greenpeace, right? Like it's So let's just quickly go over the terms of the deal as they evolve throughout the episode.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, when everyone is in the room, Shiv, Roman, Jerry, Stewie, and Sandy 1 and Sandy 2.
Sandy 1 and Sandy 2. Sandy with an I and Sandy with a Y.
That's exactly right. I and Y. They say they'll agree to a standstill with no takeover, provided the following: that Sandy and Stewie's faction get the lead on deal-making options moving forward. They'll accede to a continuation of a combined chairman CEO role. Mm-hmm. The board seats, it's going to be 4, it's 3 to start, et cetera, et cetera. Sandy says they want their costs covered and they want veto rights over any Roy family member ever taking over as CEO, which immediately the family balks at. But Stewie's just kind of like, yes, this is an important protection that we want. Like, whatever, I don't really care, but this is all your blood feud between you guys and Sandy. And so when they go back to the broader team with this proposal, Carl's in favor. Carl's like, let's go. Let's get it done, right? And Shiv is like, this specific clause is designed to humiliate the Roy family, which it is, right?
Yeah.
That this other faction has veto rights over any Roy family member ever taking over as CEO.
Yeah.
And so Jerry calls Logan, and Logan says they'll cover the cost, but no veto, right? He says like no to that originally. And they part ways saying, we'll leave it all up to the lawyers, but that's the key point that's holding up the deal. Roman, meanwhile, is having a spat with Jerry because, they kind of have a lover dynamic going on, but he's insinuating that she's trying to fuck him over if she's willing to agree to the deal as is, because again, it's this prejudicial term against the family members.
Well, and then and is this when they call? Because they also then call and say they want to take the PJs. And Roman is like, first they came for the PJs and I said nothing. And then they came for the oversized comp packages. They think they have this deal. There's a lot of stuff they're not happy with, but they also don't want to lose the company entirely. So they say, okay, let's just sign something. And Logan basically just stares and he's like, he doesn't say anything except for, I need to take a piss. And there's actually some hints that some things are going wrong with Logan. So like Connor asks if he can get all of Europe, nothing vital, cable. And Logan says yes. So that's a little sketchy. Like he's not going to let Connor do all this stuff. So it's like Tom takes them to the bathroom. And this is where they start to figure out that something is actually really wrong with him, because he starts to basically like, again, shiver and just he's completely screaming in pain. And they realize that there is something very wrong with him. And so everyone is happy. The deal's almost done. And Logan starts to believe something is fishy because, the deal's pretty close to the original deal offered in Greece. And Logan seems to still want to fight. And Shiv's like, look, if we fuck this deal, there's no more deals. And so they're trying to decide, like, do we actually go through with it or not? And Logan continues to be like, no, I don't want to do this. Like, this is bad, blah, blah, blah. And
he's basically just convinced that if someone is willing to agree to a deal with him, they must know something that he doesn't.
Yes. Meanwhile, he goes to the bathroom, he's screaming in pain, he's shivering, and they realize that like he also has a UTI and is delusional and hallucinating. So he's also completely out of it. He was supposed to be taking his meds. And so he actually, at one point, he says that there's a dead cat under his chair. And it was funny because I was looking on Reddit and there was some speculation like that it was a very specific thing that he did. The dead cat is, I guess, also a term that is talked about. No, dead catting. It's a political strategy of deliberately making a shocking announcement or anything to divert media attention away from the problem or failures in other areas. So it was a very interesting choice, and it could have been completely random.
It's also like a dead cat bounce with any asset price, right?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah, that's also true.
Even a dead cat bounces, which is a terrible thing to say. It's very graphic.
It is actually.
But like it's when something is collapsing and suddenly there's like a small resurgence in the price before it ultimately just lands on the floor.
Yeah, exactly.
And he asks his security guard what he thinks about the deal, right?
Yes.
Like
he's
like, this does not seem like, you know, and when they get down to it's just come down to whether or not Sandy and Stewie have asked that they forego private jets. They say that isn't a good look anymore. And that's the one clause now holding up the deal. Yeah. And Logan says,
but again, because they know that it's, exactly. And Roman's
so everyone's trying to figure out if this is like a genius power play or if he's gone totally crazy and they don't know. And that in and of itself is so hilarious because this is a man who's clearly hallucinating, who is not well, who hasn't taken his medicine for his UTI. And one of the side effects of not taking that medicine is that he's hallucinating. Yeah. And they're like, well, that's indistinguishable from his quote unquote brilliant business prowess, right? And they can't tell the difference. Yeah. So that's how cowed these people are of Logan that they cannot tell the difference. And so they decide to just go to the vote, right? With this whole thing in limbo. And like at that point is when he starts fretting over the medicine and the dead cat and all that stuff. Like Logan calls Tom's son and Tom's like, oh, thanks, Pop. He calls Shiv Marsha, right? Like he's totally out of it. Yeah. Kendall, meanwhile, starts talking to Stewie to try to save the deal, right? And insert himself back into this. And he calls Greg saying that if this deal goes through, that's going to strengthen Logan's position with the DOJ. And he's going to have to throw Greg under the bus to then get additional leverage. So Kendall continually is trying to insert himself in this thing, even though everyone's moved on from Kendall. Like no one cares about Kendall whatsoever, right? Yep. So anyways, once Logan's assistant, Kerry, finally reveals that Logan's off his meds and is just like babbling incoherently or whatever, right? And they realize that he might not have been in his right mind when he vetoed the deal. Yeah. Jerry's trying to take over. Shiv's nervous that if they go to the vote, they lose the whole thing. She gets everybody back together and they all rally behind Shiv and she says, I'm going to go try to save the deal. So she meets privately with Sandy. While that's happening, the president calls. So what should we talk about? The Shiv and Sandy talk or the Roman and the president call?
Let's do Shiv and Sandy. We can use the president to go into the next episode where they actually do the...
Okay, so basically what happens is Shiv and Sandy meet for like a woman-to-woman conversation. And Shiv knows pretty well how to manipulate this woman because this woman is a mouthpiece for her father. Or so we think, right? Roman even asked her at one point expressly, how do we know your dad's not just a meat puppet for what you actually want, Sandy? And she says, Sandy, well, I'm just doing what my dad tells me to, just like you guys do, right? Yeah. And so Shiv and Sandy meet. And Shiv implies that Sandy needs to empower herself to come out from behind her dad's shadow, which we all know is what Shiv is trying to do with respect to Logan. And so she says, listen, the deal's done. You should have more power. Okay, so how about this? In addition to the 3 board seats that you wanted earlier, we give you an extra board seat, which obviously means to balance everything out, we'd have to create one for me, an extra. And again, I lost count of all the board seats, but basically, Shiv uses this negotiation as a back door to elevate her position within the firm. Yep. And she does get the deal done. So she calls back to everybody and she's like, it's done. It's a done deal. Everybody starts celebrating. They run down and rescue poor Frank off the stage and Carl comes along and he's like, great news, everybody. Vote is off. Go home. You know, like, sorry we wasted all your time. Meanwhile, Frank's been sweating up there. Oh, they did put Jerry in at some point.
She did. Yeah.
And she's like, in the past 30 years,
Mm-hmm.
and starts going into her whole time or whatever, right?
Yep.
And everybody, meanwhile, they do have a celebration, and Shiv.
Well, Shiv feels like
she
she feels like she saved the day, which she did.
She really does,
and she's really proud of it.
And she's got champagne, and she keeps kind of like letting Logan know, like, hey, it was all me or whatever. And he goes, stop fucking buzzing in my ear. He doesn't reward her one bit for anything she's done. So she saved the day, but she gets no love from her dad for it.
Yeah, and at the end, like, I was a little confused about this, but he also just does something that's wildly cruel for the purpose of being cruel. So he has Carrie go tell Kendall that Logan wants to see him. And so Kendall goes and sits down in a room waiting for him. Kendall starts to call him to be like, where are you? I was told you wanted to meet me. And Jess comes in to say that he's already left and isn't coming. And Logan basically says to Carrie, like, block this number. So
remember, Kendall was calling Greg and threatening him because he knew if the deal went through that it strengthened Logan's position with the DOJ. So that's Kendall's whole leverage is, can he go to the DOJ, get immunity from them, and throw his dad under the bus and get his dad kicked out of the company. Yeah. And with the deal now being off, Kendall has lost significant leverage. So this is Logan's power play by making him wait in this sad little room. It's not a nice conference room. It's like the room where they take people to fire them, or like it looks like a room where you'd have a super day, right? Like windowless room in Nowheresville that he's going to meet with him. And Kendall's like anxiously awaiting this. And
well, that's
when Logan doesn't show up for that meeting, you realize that all he did was flex his muscle to let his son know that now he's back with the upper hand. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what happened there.
And that wraps up our Succession Season 3, Part 1. We will be back next week for Part 2. So see you then.